on YouTube watching this program. And may I encourage everyone to consider holding a watch party if you're on Facebook, and both to follow the YouTube channel and the Facebook channel, or like it, or whatever the expression is. And as we begin, I would like to introduce to you, if you've not been watching these programs earlier, Vishal Mangalwadi. Vishal is a philosopher by training and a social reformer by occupation, if one may call him that. Author of many books which have been translated into several European and Asian languages. And may I ask Vishal to speak.
Thank you, Prabhu, and thank you everyone who has tuned in to listen to this discussion on the impact of COVID-19 on global politics. And as we've been saying during these last 8-9 sessions, that our objective is to seek wisdom. There have been many conspiracy theories when COVID-19 got going, and some of these have been intended to be destructive, including to international relations. Now, we want to be peacemakers. We want to be those who pray that God's will may be done on earth as it is in heaven. What does that mean? And what does it mean particularly in the context where powerful forces, military, industrial, economic, national forces would want to lead us towards hatred and war? How does God's will get done in our hearts and in us as voters and those who are thinking and speaking and writing and acting, and including we do have some politicians. So I'm very grateful for Professor Prabhu Guptara to be moderating, hosting today's discussion. He is a publisher and a consultant to many boards. Before that, for 15 years, he ran think tanks for what was then world's largest bank. And as he has been very kind to us in spending his time in getting the speakers and hosting some of these discussions. So thank you once again. All of these efforts are voluntary. We depend upon your donations and support. So you can go on YouTube, on the internet, on revelationmovement.com, and donate there to make this possible. Thank you very much.
We should say that none of the speakers, nor Vishal, nor I, nor indeed the technical team, mostly gets paid for any of this. There's just one very part-time technical assistant who's paid because, of course, he needs to be paid. Now, I should say a word about the way we're going to go about the program today. And the way we're going to go about it is that, first of all, David Marshall is going to speak. I'll introduce him in a moment. And after him, the Lord Hastings will speak, but he will not so much give a presentation as interact in a conversation with me for, again, about 7 to 10 minutes before we go into the open discussion between the three of us and any questions that you, viewers, care to send in. And the way you can do that is either through Facebook chat, if you're watching on Facebook, or YouTube chat, if you're watching on YouTube. And if you don't like sending your comments in through YouTube chat and Facebook chat, then you can also email questions to us to the email ID questions@truthmatters, but truth matters as one word, .eu, European Union. So questions@truthmatters.eu, or of course Facebook chat or YouTube chat will get to us. May I now turn to David Marshall and invite him to speak. David is an American by birth and heritage and upbringing, but he has been deeply involved in China for many years. He's a student of Chinese. He's a student of Chinese culture. He's involved with teaching people in China at the moment. He's also the author of a very famous book, which you can see under his name at the moment, So he is well qualified to discuss with us the particular question that we have posed to him. And the question that we've asked him to address is, will the COVID crisis mean that a global shift of power will take place more quickly, more easily now than it would have done before COVID-19 from the United States to China? So, David, do please give us your thoughts.
Well, it's a pleasure to be with you today. In the 19th century, a visitor to China said, "Anybody who claims to know what's going to happen in China doesn't know anything about China." In addition, I think I should point out that probably no one on the earth predicted beforehand what would happen around the world in 2020. This has been a very strange year. The future is not within our sight, but I think one way of understanding what will happen in the future when it comes to China, which very deeply values its history, is to look a little bit at Chinese history. In 1949, Chairman Mao stood, according to one story, the recordings aren't very good, but he stood on Tiananmen Gate in Beijing, and he said, "中国站起来了,中国人站起来了." The Chinese have stood up. Chairman Mao Zedong, was a little different from some of the other Marxists in his orientation in China because he never traveled to the Soviet Union to learn about Marxism from the Soviets. He was, in some ways, a more Chinese perspective on Marxism. And for Chairman Mao, you might make a differentiation between psychological Marxism and ideological Marxism. He was not perhaps the best Marxist ideologue. He did not follow Karl Marx or Vladimir Lenin to the T, but Marxism was all about China standing up again. The methods that Mao Zedong used to try to help China to stand up did not always work very well. And they, in a sense, you could say they're very psychologically Marxist, very much like the little cultural revolution that's going on in Seattle right now and in the United States. But the point, in the end, was to help China to emerge among the families of the world, the nations of the world, in China's proper position, which is a position of leadership. So Deng Xiaoping, in the next generation, he said it doesn't matter if the cat is white or black. The only thing that matters is that it can catch the mouse. Well, that is a very pragmatic point of view. And of course, what that meant in practice was China needs an element of free enterprise in order to begin to recoup its national standing. Now, to understand this, we have to go back a little further in Chinese history, and something I think people in other parts of the world can also understand, the era of colonialism. In the Qing dynasty in the 19th century, China was a mess. China was a mess. And if we look at the second slide, we can see a little bit of what that meant. China had been divided by colonial powers. Shandong province was taken by the Germans. The French took another part of China. The English snatched another part of China. The Russians were hoovering, and the Japanese were about to the next slide, please. The Japanese were also taking bits and pieces. The British had fought the Opium War, and the Japanese were hovering in the north part of China, preparing to pounce. In addition, many young men, many very educated Chinese intellectuals were addicted to opium, which was being grown. It was being imported by the British, and then it was also being grown in much of China as well. China was in a bad way. There were little kingdoms up in the mountains that were independent from the central state. China was embarrassed. This proud ancient civilization had come crumbling down and was falling apart before the eyes of its people. This was the driving concern of the Chinese people. And even you could say to this day, this is the driving concern of the Chinese people. For the last 4 years or so, the central Chinese government has conducted a propaganda campaign, which is called the 12 Core Socialist Values. The 12 core socialist values are propagated on it seems like every empty space in China, on construction sites, on taxis, on trains, in schools, everywhere you see these 12 core socialist values. Although the funny thing is, when I ask Chinese what they are, hardly anyone can remember what they are. Modern Chinese are more concerned about their cell phones. They're more concerned about their lives. They're not quite so concerned about government propaganda anymore. But that propaganda seeps into them. And the first of the 12 core socialist values is one value that the government and the people do very deeply share. And it's the fallback value in every propaganda campaign and in every discussion of world events and in how the Chinese government censors news. And that is 爱国主义, patriotism, literally love countryism. Now, of course, because of Deng Xiaoping's policies and the entry of a kind of, I wouldn't call it necessarily pure capitalism, but state capitalism or crony capitalism or something like that. In fact, as everybody knows now, China has stood up over the last several decades. China has become an increasingly powerful country. Go to the next slide, please. Slide number 3. Yes. Here is a picture of the train stop beneath my apartment, the new Qinggui, the new above ground, I don't know what they call it in English, that kind of train, elevated train. And here we have a juxtaposition of the old Chinese culture and the new Chinese culture. The new Chinese culture is very technically advanced. Most of the world's high-speed trains are in China. And yet in front of this train station, we have an elderly man who is selling what are called spring couplets that are going to be pasted on the doorways in front of Chinese houses. And these particular spring couplets are particularly interesting. I would love to talk about those, but I don't think we have time to talk about them in very much depth. But they not only talk about it a little later, but they touch on the very deepest and most ancient Chinese beliefs about a supreme deity. And yet they're also something that are very contemporary. It's something that Chinese buy these couplets and they paste them over their doorways as a kind of a blessing for the new year. There's a New Year's festival, something that they put over. It looks very much like in the ancient Jewish people when they put the blood over the doorpost, when they put these over their doorposts. Now, I believe that China is going to be the most powerful country in the world in the next few years. I think more and more people in Asia are beginning to recognize this. Because of this vast economic expansion, it is dramatically slowed down during the COVID crisis, no doubt. There are a lot of people who are losing their jobs, as they are in other countries around the world as well. But I don't think there's anything that can stop that, essentially. It's very simple, really. China began to industrialize, modernize somewhat before India. China has 1 billion more people than the United States does. It really comes down to that. And one of the 1.4 billion people in China are ambitious. They want to earn money. They want to get ahead in life. And there are very few forces in the world that could stop their continuing progress economically, I don't think. I've seen it over the last 30 years as I've been traveling around China. The energy and the ambition are palpable. Now, during the COVID crisis, Xinhua, which is the official Chinese news agency called New China, Xinhua, New China, very much describing this contrast between the old China and the new China, wrote an article that complained that the United States had been throwing rocks on a man who had fallen into a well during the COVID crisis. In other words, this was a criticism of the Trump administration. It was a criticism of the American culture in general as being kind of a sadistic culture, that when China was at its greatest need during the COVID crisis, America cut off links between America and China, stopped planes from landing, sent our planes to Wuhan, and then other countries followed suit. And that expression, it seemed a little paranoid, of course, because even China itself was trying to protect its citizens naturally from COVID-19, and therefore was also cutting off transportation links. But it expresses another side. Let me show you briefly a picture of a high school textbook, history textbook. And here you see kind of a mixture in the Chinese official way of expressing their history. You see a mixture of West, East, and West. There's nothing in this textbook which is overtly xenophobic. Even when it discusses the history of Japan and Japan's invasion, it tries to be fairly objective in that discussion. Not objective in the sense of taking the perspective of anyone but the Chinese, but in the objective in the sense of not overtly anti-Japanese, still less overtly anti-American. Now here's a particularly interesting page. On this side of the page, there is text talking about why China developed nuclear weapons. And it says, it asks the student to consider two possibilities. First of all, China is a peace-loving country. Why would a peace-loving country like China develop these horrible weapons of mass destruction? And then the second paragraph says, well, think about the situation. America was threatening China. The Soviet Union became a threat as well. So what else could we do but develop these terrible weapons? Now, in reality, at the time that China developed nuclear weapons, it had itself been attacking all of its neighbors. It had had a war. It had conquered Tibet. It had had fighting with Taiwan, in Korea, in the Soviet Union. So describing China in the 1950s and 60s as a peace-loving country seems like a bit of a stretch, but that's how the Chinese government wishes its high school students to understand its ideology. And then on the facing page, you see this picture of a Chinese scientist who helped to develop kind of the Green Revolution in China. So you see this sort of balance that the Chinese government is trying to produce in the thinking of its citizens. So when China criticizes the United States, it will always take the Chinese perspective, and it will sometimes be quite blind in its propaganda, and one could say rather dishonest in its propaganda. But at the same time, it is trying from its own perspective to present itself as being neutral and peace-loving, even while it might be doing things that don't appear neutral and peace-loving to outsiders. So when I talked to my colleague in China yesterday, and we talked about the recent fisticuffs in the Himalayas with India, what he was hearing was all the Chinese perspective. And even as somebody who was very, very critical of the Chinese government, he generally tended to take that at face value and thinking that what the Chinese government presented was probably the truth. Now, I think that, how much more time do I have? I'm sorry, I can't hear you. I hope you hear me because I don't hear you. I'll just have to, there we go. How much more time?
You're out of time, but do finish what you're saying. That's fine.
Okay, well, I won't try to talk about things that America could do or the world can do, India and other countries. I do think that it would be helpful for America and India to develop a closer relationship. But let me make one very brief point. I think that China should recognize, and maybe the world can help China recognize, that many times in the past when China was actually rather poor, America and other countries have not taken a hostile or sadistic approach to China. There have been times when we have, but there have been times when the world has also tried to help China in different ways as well. So maybe I'll close at that for the moment, and we can pick up other points in the discussion.
During the discussion, so thank you very much for that. Very helpful to look at the whole thing historically and not just in terms of the current situations that are confronting us around the world, but also to consider the COVID and the impact it has made on China and indeed on its neighbors and the world. I'll turn now, if I may, to Michael, the Lord Hastings of Scarisbrick, Michael, you're a member of the House of Lords. You've, of course, had a distinguished career. Otherwise, you wouldn't be where you are. Tell us, because most people don't know anything about the House of Lords. Most people on this program don't know anything about the House of Lords. Could you just describe the House of Lords to us in a few sentences? What kind of institution is it? What function does it play, and so on?
Well, one of the greatest historians, living historians in the UK, described both the monarchy and the House of Lords as the serene ship of state that sails on whilst the chaotic political battles go on in the elected House. And I think that is a fair truism that those of us who are members of the House of Lords, and there are 800 of us, we mirror only the Chinese parliament in terms of size. However, despite our numbers at 800, our attendance numbers are closer to 400. And one of the highest votes ever, which was last year, ironically to do with Brexit, pushed up to about 600, but that was an exception. So here are about 400 good men and true, good women and true, members of the Church of England. Bishops are members of the House of Lords. Judges of the Supreme Court are members of the House of Lords. If necessary, royal princes could attend, but they choose to be busy moving to America or Canada or something like that. And we have members from political parties and people like me who are non-political members. We're all appointed by the Crown. It is the Queen's decision. The Prime Minister can make a recommended suggestion, but has no decision-making authority over the members of the House of Lords. And we all are equal. So we have a speaker who, to a large extent, doesn't speak other than to announce, which is different as in the elected House, where the speaker adjudicates and controls. Because the difference is that we are there to uphold the unwritten constitution of the United Kingdom, which is invested in the monarchy and the institutions of the monarchy, which includes the courts and the prisons and probation service, and of course policing and military and the House of Lords. And we are a check on the elected chamber. Just a last comment on that, to point out that when the illustrious Prime Minister Tony Blair finally produced his quite vacuous memoirs, he did contain one useful piece of information in it, which was not a regret over his enthusiasm for war against Iraq and Afghanistan, which was misplaced, as we all know now, but rather that he regretted the fact that he didn't listen to the wise advice of the House of Lords, which 6 times voted to oppose his government's push to ban fox hunting. All the things he burnt political capital on, it was fox hunting. And the House of Lords said, well, the reason this won't work, Prime Minister, is you cannot put a policeman in every field in England. So you can't police it. The foxes will run where they like, so will the horses, so don't bother. But you know, that's our wisdom, ignored, apart from in his memoirs.
So your job, Michael, if I may say so, is along with the other lords, of course, to hold the Prime Minister in check if you can, which you don't always succeed in doing. But today, of course, we're discussing not just holding the Prime Minister in check, but having a view of the world as a whole and global politics as a whole. How do you respond to David's statement in his short presentation a moment ago, when he said, I believe that China is going to be the next, going to be the most powerful country in the world? And though it's been slowed down by COVID a little bit, but it is undoubtedly going to be the most powerful country in the world. How do you respond to that?
Well, I respond with recognizing the facts that as the World Economic Forum will make freely available to all, the facts of the growth of the Chinese economy will place it way ahead of the US, not by a wide margin, but enough that would represent the gross domestic product of many countries in the course of the next, well, the next when? Is that the next 10 years, the next 20 years? Question mark. It's definitely within our lifetime, even yours and mine, Prabhu, within our lifetime, we will see China supersede the United States as the largest economy. Now, does it mean that therefore it is also going to seek a path as the world's policeman. I'm not so sure about that, but I am certain that China has not been foolish in realizing that by having a robust savings structure, lots of money available, and by having a vibrant commercial economy while maintaining essentially a controlled political system, best not to use the word communist because it doesn't quite apply realistically, but it's a controlled political system. It has delivered a very vibrant country. I've been many, many times to large parts of China, discovered cities that I never knew existed, with vast populations that are bigger than London. I've never heard of them. And then you realize, my goodness me, this place is expansive and continues to be expansive. And to find Chinese people in every corner of the world spending their enormous tourism resources freely and passionately with great enthusiasm and producing, as we now know, and you know far better than I do, producing far more intellectual capital that is possible to be produced either by the United States or the European Union put together. So China is managing to register its specific intellectual thinking and innovation in a way that outpaces any other country. So here is a big beast that is behaving like a very small weasel.
Everywhere except in certain parts of the neighborhood, such as sinking Vietnamese ships or declaring administrative zones where it actually has no right to do so, or killing Indians on its border, or claiming that Tibet and Taiwan, of course, belong to it, whether the Tibetans and Taiwanese will or not.
Yes, precisely. And I suppose China knows very well that as far as Western countries are concerned, I'm not that concerned. Uh, so it can do a little bit of stuff here and there in its backyard, but as long as it's not Japan, as long as it's not Singapore and Malaysia and the Philippines, we're okay with that. Vietnam, well, we all played there. Well, yeah, we did all kind of play there. So the Chinese are kind of wise about that. I tell you what was a very interesting reflection on China, Prabhu. I'm sure you've seen it. Last week's Economist newspaper contained an extremely brilliant middle section called The New World Disorder. And I just read you one paragraph, if I may, from it about China. This is talking about China and the UN. Now, we're tempted to think, many of us, and I know especially Americans are tempted to think the UN is a wasted space and a busted flush and all those phrases. But I think anybody in the world who has seen the importance of UN intervention in conflict or the provision of UN resources for food and services knows it's not a busted flush. It's just a complicated machine which is insufficiently honored by the governments who say they pay homage to its core principles. And had they behaved better, we would have had fewer disasters. The UN is a wise place for council, if only the council can be heard. So here is the consideration the Economist writes. China has been methodologically increasing its influence in existing institutions, not least the UN. It has raised its financial support even as America became stingier, becoming the second biggest contributor to both the general and the peacekeeping budgets. It has grown more assertive. 10 years ago, China was pretty discreet, pretending to be just an emerging country, says one European diplomat at the UN. Now I can tell you, says this diplomat, they are totally uninhibited. They want to run the system. And the article goes on to describe in considerable detail not just the weight of China's expenditure, but the positions that China is taking in leading major parts of the UN infrastructure. Now, we'd be tempted to say that that is very good peacemaking strategy. And it is using what we've often said in Western countries to be soft power to deliver hard results. It would be better to have it that way around than go out in guns and ships, satellite weapons, and aircraft.
using them. You can go back to the 1960s, the war with India. You can go back to the 1990s when it first started expanding its influence in Southeast, in the South China Seas. You can see the way it's been building up in a very systematic way. It's militarized defense fortifications all over South Asia. And I think the key question that comes up in the increasing influence that China has in the United Nations is, isn't it strange that a country that so openly flouts the rules of the United Nations wants to run the United Nations, whether it's to do with freedom of information, whether it's to do with the human rights, United Nations Declaration of Human Rights, or any of the values that the United Nations holds. So one of the most prominent members is also one of the most prominent violators of exactly the rules that it should be upholding. And that, of course, leads to the question, if China becomes the most powerful country in the world, will that be good for the world, or will that be not so good for the world?
Well, David is a far better analyst at any of this, as are you, Prabhu, than I am. But and he may be, I don't know, I won't put words into his mouth, tempted to say, well, you see, the UN was to a large extent created on a Western philosophy. And China thinks differently about how rules should work and rules should be deployed. When you come at something with a different philosophy, you get different outcomes. The Chinese could well say that the British and the Americans decided to ignore the expertise of the Security Council, plunge the world to a war with Iraq. So we flouted the rules. And we flout the rules when it serves us to flout the rules. So do the Chinese, in our perspective of things. This is not a defense of that behavior. It is to say that here are cultures clashing in the same room, the same corridors, the same concourse. And we haven't yet learned a language about how to integrate them.
Sign up to a club if you don't intend to keep its rules. If you fundamentally disagree with the rules of the club, should you sign up for that club? Should you not go elsewhere? And if you do want to sign up to the club and you want the rules to be changed, which China clearly does, then it's not enough to say, well, you weren't keeping the rules either, so that's a license for us not to keep the rules as well, because no club can function if the rules are not kept. So if all the members start flouting the rules, that doesn't help the club to function. So we are in the situation where most people respect most of the rules most of the time, and one prominent member doesn't believe in the rules at all and doesn't want to take the rules seriously at all. But maybe David wants to come in and give us his perspective on all this. David, we're not hearing you. You're mute. Oh, now we can hear you.
One of the reasons that America admires and can learn from Great Britain is this wonderful concept of a speaker who doesn't speak. I very much wish we could accomplish the same. When we talk about China, we're talking about people. And who those people happen to be, I think, is the key question. In this very brief overview that I gave at the beginning, I talked about Mao Zedong and Deng Xiaoping. Now we're talking about Xi Jinping. And I'm very concerned about him, honestly. In some ways, he's rather sly. In some ways, as Michael said, his approach is fairly careful to developing China's soft power and influence around the world. And yet, in the last several years, that influence has grown, and the approach seems to have changed as well. I would say culturally, the Chinese people, as any person in Thailand who deals with tourists will tell you, they're fairly aggressive, much more than Thai culture, for example. So I don't think that it doesn't really matter who is at the top in Beijing. There's going to be certain cultural patterns that one is likely to see. However, it's going to be manifest in different ways depending on who is actually at the helm of the nation. I think the challenge that we have right now is Xi Jinping obviously is a much slyer sort of leader than Donald Trump. That's probably not a very high bar. And yet he also seems to be making some rather large mistakes in his geopolitical strategies. He's alienated his neighbors, and he seems to be alienated many African countries as well by an overly aggressive approach to every issue and a kind of a self-righteousness. There is, I don't know what's going on in the upper echelons of power in Beijing. I don't know if anybody knows very well, but I'm hoping that there's some debate in those echelons, and there is some discussion about the way forward, and maybe some mistakes that have occurred in the last few years. And I'm hoping that the Chinese government will adjust, either perhaps through moderating Xi Jinping's power, or else convincing him that he needs to change his approach. Because I do see his approach right now as canny in some ways, sly in some ways, but also dangerous in some ways.
The assessment that China will continue to grow depends on two things. One, that its manufacturing continues to find a market around the world. And second, that there is no political crisis within the country which weakens the country politically. Now, both of those could be open to question specifically as a result of COVID, but due to trends that were preceding that anyway. By which I mean that the trade war which has been sparked off between the United States and China, with the consequences for other countries, has meant, of course, that China's market has shrunk. Not completely, of course, but it has shrunk. And as countries are now swinging away from globalization to deglobalization, erecting trade barriers, and moving into more and more manufacture for themselves with advanced robotic technologies that do not need mass manufacture of the sort that China is specialized in, but rather manufacturing for one or manufacturing small quantities, by which even a very small country like Luxembourg or San Marino could erect trade barriers around itself and prevent foreign goods, Chinese or others, from coming into San Marino or Luxembourg or whatever, and become indeed self-sufficient to itself for clothing, for concrete goods, for manufactured products, etc., etc. So we are moving into a new phase that is enabled by technology, where we do not need the kind of economic model on which China has grown. So the future trends in terms of economics do not seem to me to be as clear-cut as many people who simply take existing trends and project them forwards and say, well, China's done this and that for the last 30 years, 40 years, and if it continues to do that, the result will be X. Well, yes, if it continues to do that. But the question is, if it is not able to continue doing that, then what happens? What happens if Chinese products cannot be sold? What happens if China's growth rate continues to shrink? It has been shrinking for about 8 years now. And if it continues to shrink, what happens in terms of internal dissent? Will the Chinese Communist Party continue to be able to survive if there's increasing dissent internally and lack of economic prospects? These are all huge questions, I think, for the future. None of us knows the answer to that, but it might be worth just raising those as things we haven't talked about yet. Any quick comments on that, David or Michael?
Going back to, I don't know what the future is going to be, and anybody who does doesn't know China, but yeah, I think I'd have to gather my thoughts about that. But I do think that China's, first of all, I'm not an economist. I'm not even very good at making money, to be honest. However, the importance of exporting has decreased dramatically in China over the last 10 or 20 years. And the internal importance of the internal markets, you talk about Luxembourg or San Marino, well, obviously China has developed its own internal market to the extent that I think they will continue to advance economically. I see it on the streets. I'd also see that the government has probably the more radical and more Maoist policies of Xi Jinping's regime probably have contributed to slowing that growth down, along with reactions by other countries. But as for the future, I'm a complete blank. I'll admit that.
much more thoughtful comments that it's kind of good to hear of a major world power, which is what China is in every sense of the word. It's good to hear that we can't predict it so well, because this year has been a year of surprise non-predictions. And it certainly reveals to all of us that we need to be less controlled in our desire to get everything straight from January to December, much more flexible about the kind of lives we ought to be living. We know that there will be on November the 4th a cataclysmically significant day for world leadership, and the American people better carpe diem, seize it, and see what they do. We don't know that, whether they will. So some things are fixed, but we have no idea what happens next. And China has the opportunity, sorry, David, I'll just wrap this thought up. China has the opportunity, having been a benefactor, and I can say that having traveled to pretty much 16 countries across the continent of Africa, where I've seen the benefit of China's infrastructure investment. Very easy for people to bellyache that it comes with a lot of Chinese add-on. Well, all Western aid comes with add-on, whether it's British, French, which is pretty small in the French case, but it's British or American, it comes with a lot of add-on. It's just that we weren't smart enough to realize that what a lot of amazingly wonderful people in Africa wanted were roads and airports and bridges and railways and stadiums. And they're physically obvious things that show economic progress. China was smart to realize that. And we don't need to slap the Chinese for seeing the brilliance of their move. We need to ask ourselves why we were so sluggish. Cultural programs are fantastic, very helpful. Of course they are. There's nothing quite as good as a road. The people need to get things around to deliver trade. So I hope that China will continue to behave as the best friend it can find itself to be, and that we will try to make sense of a different way of being friends.
Can I turn sorry, David, you're going to say something, please do.
I was just going to say, I agree with quite a bit of what Michael just said. And I think 30 years ago, I actually did expect, I forecasted that China would be catching up with the United States about this time. So looking at the growth rates in Japan and Taiwan and the tigers in Southeast Asia, it was fairly predictable, seeing what Deng Xiaoping was doing and how they were opening the economy, that this growth rate was going to, probably about this time, this was going to happen. So what is surprising is the slowdown. I mean, you would expect slowdown when you start to head towards the peak, but I don't think China's quite at the peak yet. So the slowdown is a little bit of a surprise. But I agree that the infrastructure is absolutely dazzling, absolutely amazing. Airports, trains, roads. Coming back to SeaTac Airport in Seattle, I'm rather ashamed to look at our dingy old airport and compare it to the airports that I see going up in China.
Very good. Would you mind if I turn the topic a little away from China, because we're looking at the impact of COVID on global politics, and I wonder what other things you see going on around the world in terms of the impact of COVID. What impact do you see, for example, COVID making on the European Union as the next, or certainly one of the three biggest economic blocs in the world? Any thoughts on that, Michael, and specifically in relation to the UK, as it has technically already withdrawn from the EU, and as it's in a situation where we will soon apparently crash out, we meaning the UK, will soon apparently crash out of the European Union without a deal, unless obviously things are speeded up. Any reflections or thoughts on how COVID has affected this whole situation in the EU and specifically in relation to the UK?
Well, one of the things that is probably most obvious to say is here we are 5 months on from if we're tempted to say, an imported disease into the European Union, and every country battened down its own hatches and went for bust in its own policies, philosophy, medical advice. There may have been a bit of equipment sharing, but when it came to coordinated health or technical strategy, that was non-existent. And this enormous infrastructure sitting in Brussels and the even more wasteful one in Strasbourg, the irony of that decision haunts the EU forever, and particularly the French. But here was this infrastructure of civil servants and buildings, facilities, and intellectual capacity of no useful effect, not certainly as apparent to the peoples of Europe during this time period. No voice from the EU, no specific advice from the EU. It was a UN agency that was running the patch, the World Health Organization. And I suppose it raises the flag at long last to say to the remaining countries of the European Union, and Prabhu, as you know, I was and I remain a supporter of the UK's presence in the EU. I wish the Brexit referendum had never happened. I wish that we had not accepted the vote to leave. It was not mandatory on Parliament to do so, and sound politics would have said, be pragmatic. But we're not in a sound political period. So we are where we are. And whether we crash out or we get one of those patched up last minute deals, there are big questions to be asked for the peoples and countries of the EU. Where were they when the crisis came? This was a moment to define Europe's value. It failed. It failed. No country even thought to ask the EU, shall we shut our borders? They just did. And what could the EU do about it? So there is a real need now to look hard at the project and stop pretending that everybody will fall into line, because we don't know what's coming next year, or in fact this October. And it could be a health crisis again. It could be a military crisis. It could be an economic crisis already in some uncomfortable form. We don't know what's coming. But what we do know is already beginning to happen. I say this cautiously, and you again are far more expert at this than me. But we know that there is a very significant rise of far-right nationalism in Germany. And we all fear that and its implications. And we know that there are bizarre behaviors for which Hungary and Poland are getting away scot-free, as we would say in England. I don't know why we say scot-free, but we just do say scot-free. But they're getting away with it as though the EU hasn't noticed. Maybe they can't read the Financial Times because it's there for all to see. It's printed in their language. They should read it. It's the truth that the EU is inept at dealing with fringe realities and central crises. And it's proved itself, I'm afraid, not to be sufficient to the task.
The question that arises, of course, Michael, is if the European Union no longer continues to be united, but disintegrates, in effect, whether it formally
shattering of the global dream. It's already vulnerable. America, well, under Trump, certainly America has begun to decide that its priorities must be its priorities. And there was a time not too long ago when we were a lot younger that we thought about the longing for a world to come together after wars. And we saw much evidence of that. And now we see the disarray that is caused, the confusion and the fear that is caused by a fractious, self-interested policy. We don't want that in Europe. We don't need that in Europe. And it would not aid the poorest parts of our world, remembering that if one of the probably most important negative outcomes of coronavirus is that the most destitute poor have had their numbers bulked by an extra 200 million, pushing it close to 1 billion again, just because economies have gone on the slide and resources have become thin and food is getting tougher to access. So we don't want a fractured Europe. We certainly don't. We want a a Europe which is coherent about its international public duties and stop pretending that it can pull itself together to become a political union like the US. In fact, we've also seen that, yes, there may well be a political union at the heart of Washington, D.C., but not across all the states of the US. The Confederate flag is flying in places down south it shouldn't be flying. And states are still going, well, we'll do our thing, whatever Washington says. So the unions are hard to do, even in the place where they say they're most united. The EU needs to wake up to that and do what it should do, reach out to the needs of the world, meet the SDGs, support the poor.
Realistically speaking, of course, one can hope for this and one wishes for this and one supports that. But one must also be realistic and say the trends are clearly in the opposite direction. I think you were saying that yourself a moment ago. And if the trends continue to go in that direction, obviously we don't know, but if they continue to go in the same direction, and places like Catalonia want to secede from Spain, or places like Scotland want to secede from the United Kingdom, how do you think that will be perceived around the world, and what will be the consequences of such moves, do you think?
Well, there's a little positive to any place that pursues autonomy and freedom for its people, as long as autonomy leads to more freedom. And you can't have more freedom if you're going to crash the economy. And that would, I know, be the fact in Scotland. It would crash the economy. It cannot sustain itself in independence. It would join the back of the queue behind everybody else to rejoin the EU. So forget it. It's not a benefit to Scotland. Catalonia's case, it's a different construction. It could well represent itself like many of the smaller aspects of European states which are quite independent. And remembering the EU has got little places like Liechtenstein and even Luxembourg in it, with equal votes to Germany and the UK and France. And so can the European Union hold together with little places? And can little places matter? Yes, they absolutely can. But as long as the economy is going to benefit people more robustly, and that economy can be a generous international economy, if it drains out on ideology, we've wasted our time.
But isn't it the case that we are wasting our time and the economy is being drained by the rise of nationalism, whether of the far right sort, as you were saying in Germany and so on, even in the UK, or whether it's of a less than extreme far right sort, but is still nationalist rather than internationalist, rather than globalist. So the retreat from a global economy into nationalist economies is impoverishing every country to a lesser or larger extent. And if push comes to shove and people say every country is erecting its own barriers, the future is uncertain, we would rather be looking after ourselves than be stuck in a big system. Catalonia, Spain in the case of Catalonia, United Kingdom in the case of Scotland. What is there really to prevent that kind of sense of saying, I don't want to be part of this big caboodle because my interests are not going to be number one for them, and the economies are going down anyway, therefore it's better for me to fight on my own, even on a smaller patch, even knowing that the economy is not going to be very good, because the economy is not very good anyway.
Well, in the UK's case, which I can speak about a bit more authoritatively than certainly Catalonia's case, I realise it's a different reality, but what held Scotland in last time, and I suspect if after this term, because the Prime Minister here says no referendum in this term, and he's no reason to give in to that, and the Scottish National Party has got a lot of its own internal turmoil around its personalities, let alone many of its educational, health and economic failures in Scotland. It's not in a strong position to really push for a robust referendum. But what held it in last time is that sense of there are things about the United Kingdom, constitutionally, the monarchy, the BBC, the National Health Service, the institutions of arts and culture, which are commonly shared between the four nations. And that matters to a lot of people. And there may well have been the possibility last time round that there was oil money to be had. But there isn't oil money to be had now. Its value is not sufficient to carry Scotland to independence. So those cultural issues, those constitutional issues will count a lot.
Even though the BBC is, of course, being drained of its resources, and the cultural institutions are being drained of their resources. So all the institutions that you have mentioned holding the United Kingdom together are actually being drained of resources.
They are thinner than they were. There is no doubt about that. But and as you know, I'm a former BBC executive and very proud of that. And one of the things that ironically happened during this coronavirus period was a great surprise to the BBC and a great joy to the BBC, but the facts are there to prove it, which is the public went rushing to secure information. When you've got a health pandemic going on of whatever size, and we've just had today essentially the end of the lockdown, social distance down to 1 meter, pubs and clubs open, restaurants open. I mean, this is England getting back to cricket. Now, if that is the case, and we're all remembering what did we trust in this time? And social media was a disaster at providing accuracy. It was very good at passing around philosophies of deceit and all sorts of suspicious information. But when it came to knowing what was going on, the BBC, the regional, local news, BBC Radio, the broadcasts every single day at 5 o'clock from Number 10, the detailed analysis, and even with the youth viewing figures, they shot through the roof, vastly more than any other provider. So the BBC ironically comes through this period healthier, stronger, better resource. I think when it comes around to the next license fee discussion, which is in just a few short years' time, as long as no one else can make it better, and always that's been part of the BBC's great strength of keeping it better, there's another round of 10 years to go. I'm hopeful.
You put the matter very positively and optimistically, Michael, and I share your optimism and positivism both about the BBC and about the National Health Service. And we hope, of course, that the United Kingdom stays together and that the United Kingdom economy does well in spite of Brexit. Though, of course, there are ticklish issues like this border between Northern Ireland and the rest of the UK. How does that play out? I mean, how can you have a part of the UK which is not part of the UK?
Well, the artistry, this is going to be, like a lot of these things, a piece of choreography that probably gets stitched around at the last minute. And this is what a number of people would often refer to in some of the side conversations in Parliament, which is there's a thing called the Greek solution, which is look the other way and don't get too precise about everything. There is, I've gone on that north-south border in Ireland, which, I mean, you forget which side you're on by the time. And thank goodness for that. And it needs to be more like that. This is not an argument for the absorbing of the north into the south or the absorbing of the south into the north, which I don't think would ever happen, but not an argument the other way around. But this is an argument to say that we are in a world of globalized pragmatism. And the Greek solution helps us to do that.
So the great British art of fudging will be the great sort of skill for the future.
Exactly.
So we've talked a little bit about China. We've talked a little bit about Europe and the UK. I'd like to turn, if I may, to the United States. And you've drawn our attention to the United States a little bit by talking about the November 4 elections coming up. How do you think America has held up in the world in relation to COVID? And has America's reputation been knocked, or has America's reputation been strengthened by how it has responded to the COVID-19 crisis, both internally but also internationally? Maybe David, you want to start us off on that? Sorry, I'll just start with David, if I may.
I'm speaking from the suburbs of the nation state of Chaz, actually, the new little radical neighborhood that kicked the police out in downtown Seattle, above downtown Seattle on Capitol Hill. To be honest, in all my life, I've never been more concerned about American politics and about where the United States is going. And I go back a little bit to the theories of the French literary anthropologist René Girard, who talked about scapegoating. And he said that one of the things that tends to typify a scapegoating episode or a witch hunt is there tends to be, well, often there's a pandemic beforehand. And I see COVID-19 as people being forced into their homes and whatnot. I think there's a kind of a mass psychosis or kind of a cultural revolution going on in the United States that really, really concerns me very, very deeply. I'm heartbroken about it, in fact. What's been going on in my hometown, which is a beautiful city, and mobs tearing things apart and scapegoating the police and burning things down. Honestly, as a teacher, as someone who's involved in education in China, it is a little hard for me right now to tell Chinese parents, come to the United States and study. I'm concerned about safety. I'm concerned about where America is going. I'm concerned about people being fired from their jobs for not having holding the right opinion, woke capitalism and whatnot. This is a very difficult time in American history, but I also see that there's the influence of this pandemic in other countries. I don't know what it's been in Europe, but I see some of the similar kinds of psychological challenges in Japan and possibly in China as well. So I'm hoping that some of this anger, this terrible anger and hatred that has cropped up over the last few weeks will die down as the effects of this pandemic and the economic problems begin to fade a little bit.
Michael, is that your sense as well in relation to the United States first? I'll come on to the global explosion of hate in a moment. But let's just look at the United States for a moment longer. How do you feel, Michael, about how things have been going in the United States in terms of the US reaction or response or ability to handle the crisis of COVID?
Well, sadly, of course, the death rate continues to escalate as we speak, and the number of confirmed cases continues to escalate. The president pretended at the weekend that a good way of dealing with it was to slow the testing process down, because then you get fewer results. And that's a very interesting manipulative statistical tool that we've never quite seen used before. But I do think the one thing it has shown very clearly, Prabhu, which has been a joy to many of us to see, people like Andrew Cuomo, the governor of New York State, for whatever his weaknesses may be, has been a galaxy star through this process. And some other governors, likewise, have been more robust in maintaining quality of health service, testing systems, and confidence around coronavirus. That's certainly been the case in the White House. Now, they're not. Are they the best? Are they the best people possible in the world who have held a state, its people, its cities, a country together? No, because this thing came from left field. It was promised from the White House to be of no significant consequence. It's going to brush away. It'll all be gone very soon. There wasn't a serious preparatory strategy. But there are leaders who put in the best of what they can forward, and they have a greater level of robust quality than is seen in the White House. So it has shown us that America's state-based governance system, in some cases, can maintain the constitutional balance correctly. And that is good to see.
Good things and bad things in the US. Probably too many bad things for a lot of Americans at the moment. But as we look at the United States from outside, we can see both the good and the bad in perhaps a little more objective fashion. the strengths of America in terms of economics, in terms of innovation, in terms of care, and so on. But let's just switch our attention to the whole question of the explosion of global rage at the moment. Before that, I would like to just ask the question, how do you see the prospects for Africa at the moment? Specifically sub-Saharan Africa, but Africa as a whole.
If we're talking about coronavirus, or we're talking more generally?
How do you see Africa? What has been the impact of coronavirus on Africa, and how do you see the prospects for Africa, specifically in light of coronavirus, COVID-19?
Well, again, this last week's Economist contained quite a lot of very useful information. Thankfully, Johns Hopkins University, great American educational institution, has been gathering the data on a daily basis, and what data is available through different African country health systems and governmental systems is coming into the same pot as everybody else. And what it seems to paint a picture of is the earlier stages of coronavirus growth, but not an overwhelming and cataclysmic, disastrous, catastrophic outcome. One of my very dear friends has been helping the Ghanaian government both do its lockdown and end its lockdown, which it has now done. And that has been a significant success, confirmed so by the World Health Organization. The levels of death are very low across different countries of the continent. And if anything, Prabhu, I say this painfully, it has distracted us from what are the really painful day-to-day deaths from standard-based waterborne diseases, from diarrhea, from cholera, from a series of other absences of both food, medicine, and health conditions, which are far more important. And we mustn't be consumed with thankful that the numbers of coronavirus deaths are low, but actually, goodness sakes, isn't it time to look at the rest that we've been very happy to ignore if we're completely candid about it?
So let's turn to this global explosion of hate, which has found some very acceptable and possibly good outlets for it, as well as other expressions which have not been good. Would you say that the expression of rage has come in different countries for different reasons, in relation to different reasons, but arising out of the same soil, and that the same soil has been just getting to the end of your tether in terms of things not going well for you economically, politically, too much stress, and so on? Or do you think there are other reasons for this global rise of rage?
Well, the rage comes from watching a killing as long as 8 minutes and 46 seconds. No Hollywood producer would make a film that shows the killing of anybody for that long. The scene would change after 40 seconds at the most. So it is the stark and painful, searingly obvious imagery that sticks in our mind that has set off this rage around the world, because it has then shown up that there were so many other cases where very little was done. And it's worth remembering that in the time period since the death of Mr. Floyd and his funeral, which was on the 9th of June, that in that time period, police in Atlanta shot another man dead who was 100% unarmed and innocent and was simply taking a break in his car. Now, this pattern of relentless police persecution, aggravated and aggravating behavior, of course, has got decades built into it. Time magazine spoke last week about America's way of dealing with racism has always been through the criminal justice system. by bloating the numbers of people held incarcerated in prison, by harsh lifetime sentences, by removing people's democratic rights, both in prison, but also more importantly, once they come out, if they come out, and by this uncomfortably large killing spree, so-called deaths, and taking people down. So where does it leave us at this junction? The rage is not yet assuaged. And until there are the prosecutions of those 4 men, especially the key killer, and until there is either done by the House of Representatives or the Senate, what the White House put out was meaningless blather on police reform. But until one of the houses responsible for working with the states delivers state-based supported solutions that are going to change policing culture and decision-making. And I would include in that the suggestion, say this is a Brit, obviously knows as an American, but should a man die in police custody, the accountability for that, yes, of course, rests on the killer. It also rests on the chief. And when the chief must pay the price, like you would in the CEO of a company, well, we'll soon see police behavior change. Fobbing it off on the taxpayer or making sure that it's distant from the decision makers isn't acceptable. This pattern has gone on too long. Now, it's worth also remembering, as last week's Economist also pointed out, that the highest levels of police violence in the world are not in the US or in the UK. They're ironically in countries like Brazil and South Africa, where many more are massacred at the hands, and Zimbabwe, at the hands of a cruel and vindictive so-called detective policeman. So perspective is important.
Indeed. And very often we do lose perspective because the media tend to focus on highlights, which are going to bump up the viewing figures, and don't often give us the kind of perspective that's needed in terms of in-depth analysis and the kind of comparative facts that you're quoting. David, can I turn to you and ask you, as a white American, what your feeling is about this explosion of rage, at least in the United States?
Yes. Well, first of all, I'm part of a biracial family. My wife is Japanese, and since I was a child, I have detested bullying more than anything else. But I completely disagree with Michael's analysis here. To be honest, and I have looked through the data, I've looked through the stories of killings by police in the United States, one by one, and Andrew Cuomo, the governor of New York, is responsible for hundreds of times more deaths of innocents in the last few months than the police are in the last year. In other words, in the United States, the police kill about 1,000 people a year. And usually when you look at their stories and you find out what really happens, it's something like this gentleman goes to his girlfriend's place of work and shoots her, and then runs off down the street and dies in a shootout on I-5 or something like that. I look through the stories time and time again. The kind of cases exemplified by George Floyd are extremely rare, and they're not focused on black suspects at all. In fact, the percentage of suspects who are killed by police, according to Roland Fryer at Harvard University, is actually lower from white police than it is from other police. And it's fairly proportional to the population of suspects in general. So there's no evidence that this one case exemplifies a sweeping, culture in police departments of brutalizing the population. In fact, according to Roland Fryer again and other scholars who have studied this subject, what is called the Ferguson effect takes place when the police back off and refuse to agree. It's the people who suffer are the women very often, and other young black men. Because of the Ferguson effect, because the police back off and refuse to, they're afraid to be aggressive in policing infractions that are fairly minor, the result is generally that hundreds, even thousands of people end up dying because the murder rate increases in communities, especially among the core problem here, in my opinion, is the breakdown of the family in some communities. And if a father is not there to raise his children, that child is much more likely to engage in a life of crime and to get into trouble. And then it falls on the police to try to deal with that usually a young man, not usually a young woman. If you looked at the rates of killings by police as a whole, you might think that the police really have it in for men, because more than 90% of those who are killed are in fact male. Or you might think that they really have it in for Native Americans as opposed to Asian Americans, because a Native American is 10 times more likely to be killed by the police than an Asian American suspect. Why is that? It's not because of the color of the skin. They're the same color skin. The reason is because of a fundamental breakdown in community, and that is something that needs to be addressed. Why in the last 70 or 80 years, the African American community has gone from about 10 or 20% unwed children being raised by unwed mothers to something like 70% children being born out of wedlock. The white community has done the same thing. The white community has gone to about 30% being raised out of wedlock. That is, in my opinion, a vastly more important problem than, notice that the uprisings and the cultural revolutions and I would even use the word witch hunts against the police have occurred in cities that are extremely liberal. I've lived in Seattle most of my life, and I live in a biracial family. This is not a city that is full of hostility against minorities or any particular racial people. In fact, I'm probably talking too much and saying too much. As you can see, I'm rather passionate about this subject. I probably better not say too much more. Maybe we better let Michael have a chance to rebut my views here.
That's fine. Very good. Thank you for sharing that. It's an important consideration. What is the balance between reforming the police, which obviously needs to be done, and looking at the root sociological causes for the problems that arise, which the police is trying to arrest. So that, of course, is a much bigger question that we need to look at. Why are families breaking down, whether they're white or whether they're black? Why do Asian families seem generally to hold up, of Indian, Pakistani, etc. backgrounds, seem to hold up better in exactly the same economic, political, social, and so on, technological, and so on conditions? These are interesting questions to look at, and we should do so at some time. But of course, this is not the time to do that. Are there any last-minute thoughts in relation to the impact of COVID on global politics? For example, I have a question here from Richard Stephenson, which asks, what has happened to groupings like BRIC? They seem to have disappeared completely. We can look back to groupings like the tiger economies. They've disappeared completely. Any reflections from the disappearance of these kinds of assemblages of countries to what is likely to happen as a result of COVID as we look around the globe? Michael, any thoughts on that?
Just a quick comment on that, I'm conscious of the time, which is that the US president, as he remains still, has sought to expand the G7 to become the G whatever. That would include a string of countries he feels are more favorably disposed to the United States as it is now. The G20, well, we don't know. We'll see what happens in October. But if that's an indicator around G7 behavior, and the G20 he's never been a fan of anyway, certainly had a hard time with Angela Merkel, even when you look at all sets of the pictures from last year, I think that the groupings, as they were, have to have a clear, positive purpose. And it's one thing to meet, to talk about how bad things are. It's another thing to meet, to learn how to make them all collectively better. And that absence of having the solutions is probably what's causing the falling away.
So what we are seeing is actually a lack of global leadership, whether it's by people like President Trump, or whether it's by the European Union, or whether it's by the UK. And the great lack at the moment is of a vision for a global order which would benefit everybody in light of the new economic and political and technological situations which are there. On that note, I would like to thank you, Michael, very much for your participation in the program, Lord Hastings of Scarisbrick, and David Marshall, the teacher and author, for his comments as well, for your comments as well. Thank you both. But don't jump off the program, because there are a couple of announcements to make, and we would like to talk to God about these issues before we close the program. And I'd like Vishal to do that in a moment. But thanks also to Andreas for bringing me the questions. I must apologize that I was not always giving the names of the people whose questions were being asked. I was not always asking the questions in the exact words of the people concerned, but we will try to redress that in the records of the proceedings of this live stream as we go forward. So I would like to point out that next Tuesday we do not have a live stream, because from this point onwards the live streams are becoming fortnightly rather than weekly. So the next live stream is going to be on the 7th of July. Details of that will be released, of course, nearer the time. But I would like to thank all the speakers, all the listeners, the people providing the technological help, Finn and Andreas. And may I close by inviting people to subscribe once again for the YouTube channel and the Facebook page. And I would like to invite Vishal now to conclude our meeting, our discussion, by talking to God about it.
Is Andreas giving notices first?
Andreas? If he is, he will do so after you finish talking to God.
Yes. Father, we thank you for this privilege of thinking thoughts about what's happening in the world, with our failures, with our sin, evil. Your heart must be broken and grieve as much as our hearts. But we thank you that you called Abraham to make him a great nation, so that through him you might bless all the nations and show them the way to greatness and goodness. And we pray, Father, that as nations such as China become increasingly powerful, we pray that they might begin to play the kind of role that other nations have played in blessing, in seeking to serve, and seeking to change. And we pray that this vision of loving and serving our own nation, and then making our nation strong enough to be able to bless other nations, that this will become once again a clear perspective and passion in our national and international leadership. We thank you for the global institutions that exist, and we pray that you will show us how to make them more effective and more powerful in accomplishing the great visions and missions that these institutions have had. So we thank you again for this morning, this evening in other parts of the world, and we pray that you will continue to impart your wisdom to us and transform us. We ask this in Jesus' name. Amen.
Yeah, okay. So hello everyone. It's been a pleasure to watch today, and we have had very much interaction by the audience, and we've had compliments of people saying this was the best discussion in the series. So thank you very much for preparing and contributing, Prabhu, Michael, and David, and also Vishal, of course. What I would like to point out is that we will continue on in this series, and it's not finished. It's just the opposite. So we're moving into very interesting topics that probably some of you may have waited to show up. And I will just mention some of them to make you curious. One of the topics that we will talk about in the future, and this will probably be the one on July 7th, we are just gathering the speakers here, is public policy when research results and scientific models produce unclear or contradictory results. So this is one of the questions that I, at least, have been struggling with for the last months quite a lot in discussing with friends and family, that we have researchers saying this and other researchers saying something different. How do we deal with this from a Christian worldview perspective? And another topic that also has been very influential and very up to the front is, what about the public media? This is not the fake news topic, but it's the topic of what makes good media? What does it take to contribute to be good media? And this is public media. In another discussion, we'll then talk about what does it need in the new international, do we need new international organizations? So supranational organizations, do we need anything new? What about the United Nations and other world organizations? Are they doing a good job? Have they been doing a good job in this crisis or not? And then, of course, the topic of social media and the influence of social media and what's been happening on the social media. So I'm just teasing you a little bit and trying to keep you online with us, telling you that we're not finished at all. We're entering into the most interesting part of the whole series in season 2, so stay with us. And if you want to be informed about what's happening, my suggestion is you should subscribe to the channel, either to the YouTube channel or to the Facebook channel or page, and that way you will always be informed about the new discussions that are coming up. Other way to stay in touch with us is simply to go to revelationmovement.com and subscribe to a newsletter. And we will send out newsletters from there that will inform you about the dates and the topics and the speakers that are upcoming. So this much from me, Prabhu, and back to you. Thank you. Wait, Prabhu, I have to unmute you. I'm sorry. So here you go.
Thank you. Thank you, Andreas, for that announcement. And thank you not just for that, but also for all the other work that you do, behind the scenes to enable this to happen. You have, of course, yourself hosted and moderated one, Andreas, but most of the work is behind the scenes. So thank you very much for that. Well, our time is nearly up, and thank you very much for joining us for this transmission today. Look forward to being in touch with you again another time. Bye for now.